Hey everyone, today we're sitting down with Amy Jo Kim, who's a game designer, startup coach, and the CEO of Game Thinking. She was part of the early design teams at Rock Band, The Sims, Ultima Online, eBay, and Netflix. She's made amazing consumer experiences that have touched billions of people. Her system helps founders and product managers skip ahead to product market fit. This interview is for builders and creators and people who want to learn how to do it right. Let's get into it. Amy Jo, thank you so much for coming on the YouTube channel. You are really just one of the most important resources out there on how to get to product market fit and to get it sort of 10 times faster than you would if you were doing it on your own without these tools and the experience that you have. So I love to start off with just hearing more about your path into tech as a product person, as a designer, especially around games and social.
Garry, it's a real delight to be on here. I'm a fan. I love your channel and your point of view. We have a lot of overlap. I'm really thrilled. Yeah, my path into tech was long and winding, as many people's are. I first came in through science and engineering. I have an undergrad degree in experimental psych and a grad degree in behavioral neuroscience. And I put myself through grad school programming. So that really gave me a core background in the scientific method and a few other interesting things. And that got me a job at Sun Microsystems back in the day. So I've been on the internet for a really long time. I came up as an engineer learning to code, which I really loved. Grew into a UX designer. I became the UX lead on a 20-person database interface project at Sun. I worked at Paramount and Viacom after that as a producer and designer of new experiences. We worked as in the advanced research lab, got to work with brands like Star Trek and MTV, Nickelodeon, Star Trek, Entertainment Tonight. And that was amazing. That was a real education in how media companies work. What I was seeing was there was a lot of interest in online communities. And then the World Wide Web happened in the mid 90s. As the person at Paramount and Viacom that knew the most about the internet, I was the designated anything online person. They'd send me to conferences. I would work with brands to spin up prototypes of how something might look 2 to 3 years out, that kind of work. One year they sent me to the Computer Game Developers Conference and I didn't know much about it, but okay, what is all this? And it was like I had found my home. It was very tribal. There was a lot of odd people that were incredibly creative and analytical at the same time. There was a costume contest. There was really fascinating talks about graphics and audio and narrative and system design and social design and all these things I was interested in. I really plunged into games, I did some projects with MTV and Nickelodeon. I actually helped Nickelodeon launch their first AOL presence. From that, I spun out my own consulting company, building online games and social systems and communities for websites, for games, for marketplaces. I worked with eBay, Rock Band, Ultima Online, The Sims, Covet Fashion, Netflix, did a really interesting project with Netflix when they were early to streaming. Was really able to work both in games and products, which I think is a really interesting crossover, and was able to work on many projects, a handful of which were huge worldwide hits. And they were all unlikely. They were every single one of them projects where people said to us at the beginning, what are you, crazy?
Things that a billion consumers or multi-billions of people have interacted with, you got to see when they were just sort of an idea, sort of a far-fetched idea at that.
Exactly. And so I've synthesized what I learned from those best practices, many of which are counterintuitive, into a system called game thinking that I use to help startups, global brands, and game studios innovate and find product market fit 10x faster.
I mean, it sounds like there are some patterns. There's some patterns that just keep coming back over and over again. And I love that you pointed out that So many of these brands that we've heard of today, they all started as almost a fringe thing, right? I don't know. I mean, even like the rock band idea, having a music game that would be that popular. When you're sitting down to create the first version of it, sometimes it's sort of hard to see without actually playing it that it would actually play out the way it did.
Oh, yeah. It was ridiculously unlikely. Think about it. Who is going to buy $160 worth of plastic instruments and clutter up their living room with it? That people were like, really? You think people are going to do that? Now, that studio had worked on Guitar Hero, and I had worked on some versions of Guitar Hero, not the original, but some follow ons. And I had a 10-year long relationship with that studio that started based on the game I designed with MTV. It's funny how these things go. When we created Rock Band, they'd been dreaming of it for years. And there were some very, very hard problems to solve about feeling like you're playing together when you're not in the same place, synchronization problems, etc. But if any studio could do it, this studio did. But the business problems were even harder. Part of my job was to interview people early, but also later. Another part of my job was to design the social systems that were powering it, that let bands meet up and how you formed a band and all the stuff around the core music. But one of the huge lessons I learned there that's very counterintuitive to a lot of people, but I learned it on that one, I learned it on The Sims too, is if you don't have your core learning loop right, if you don't have that, I think of it as the day 21 session experience. If you don't have that re-engagement experience really understood and polished, you're building a leaky bucket.
That's a dangerous, dangerous place.
Can you relate?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we work with startups, it's the number one thing, especially for consumer. Either you have 20% or above is like the bare minimum of what you can build a consumer brand on. But if you're at 20, you can usually get to 25 or 30. And then once you're around there, you can actually have an app that is among maybe the top 100 in the world, which is interesting. That's why the retention curve matters so much. And it's a lot of people focus on D1, D7. You're talking about D20, D30, D90. These are actually the indicators of real product market fit.
And I learned it in gaming, but it works for everything. I used it with Netflix. I used it with eBay. It really works for anytime you want long-term retention. So I remember working on Ultima Online, which for those who don't know, it's like World of Warcraft,
Yeah.
but earlier. It was
Legendary. Yeah. I mean, all of the mechanics that are now commonplace in MMORPG came out of Ultima Online.
And there's so many lessons we learned about managing griefers and unintended consequences of complex systems that are still relevant today. By the way, Ralph Koster, my dear colleague on that game and longtime friend, has some amazing talks that I've recently been sending to people that are lessons from MMOs about the kind of things we're seeing today on social
Oh,
networks.
that's cool. I'll bug you for the links. We'll put it in the description.
I'd love to share that with everyone because let's make new mistakes. We've got some lessons from the old mistakes. So I still remember the day when we were working on UO, which had really hard problems to solve. I still remember the day that one of the designers on the team brought in his year in the life document. Now, as a UX designer, I was used to writing day in the life scenarios, maybe a week in the life, day 1 to day 7, just like you. I came up with that I learned that from my mentors. Now I'm working on the game and this guy brings it in. Now, mind you, it was single spaced and in medieval font. So it was kind of hard to read. He had thought through a whole year in the life of a player in the game, really thought it through. And here's the key thing, not all the details in the interface, because that's kind of fun and easy to get into if you're a designer. I love getting into that stuff. He had thought it through in terms of what unfolded over time in the experience. What systems came into play in month 3? How did the level, not just like, a bunch of levels, but how did they actually work? What was what we call the elder game, which is the kind of new experience that unlock when you kind of ground through a bunch of levels, how, et cetera, et cetera, et
Yeah,
cetera.
did it get to the level of the emotional experience of the player, whether it's accomplishment or...
Well, that was just embedded in it. I don't think he particularly called it out. Some people will call it out. There's an amazing presentation by Robin Hunicke about Journey, which is just a great game to study. It is. There's so many lessons in there about less is more. There's a great talk where she really draws a Kurt Vonnegut style emotional curve of the emotional journey that you're taking people on in the game. In this particular case, I think it was embedded in it. It wasn't so much called out. This was more about imagine, if you will, it's day 1. Now it's day 7. Now it's day 30. It was the first time I had ever heard anybody really think through and take me, the learner, like the listener, the proxy for the user, on a journey like that. I went, wow. And I'm a system designer. So I'm going, okay, how does the system work if it would deliver that kind of thing? And maybe these two work together. And that's really what it is. And so it's that kind of thinking shrunk down to what works for you that really drives retention and habits. It's also a deep understanding of the existing habits of your customers. And I learned that on games too. So Will Wright I've worked with him on many projects. And on the original Sims project, we ran all these tiny parallel experiments at the beginning. And I was like, what are we doing? It was not familiar to me at the time. All these little experiments, we were finding the fun. We were finding the juice. We were doing what's called stage gate theory. If you go look that up, and I've seen really good game studios do this too. They'll have multiple experiments going, and it makes sure that you're not falling in love with any one idea, that you're not making your ideas earn the right to investment by people liking them. And it forces you to really get into that core learning loop and really start to test it and iterate it early. Part of the trick is you test it with people that are a cutting edge, leading edge proxy for your larger audience, your hot core superfans, your early adopters. And this is something that a lot of people mistake. Many smart investors know this, but frankly, there's a lot who don't, and they get really into TAM. Show me your TAM slide and design for TAM, and how is this going to reach, all these people? And it needs to reach all these people, and you really want to because you see it, you can see the market. But no innovation starts with the larger audience. It always starts with the weird edge. And it's a beachhead, not a destination. And once I really understood from working with all these hit makers that you got to find your beachhead really before you ship and then head toward the larger market. There's no other way to do it. Once I understood that and I could teach it to others, I saw people cutting 6 months of time, 8 months of time off their development schedules.
That's fascinating. So it sounds like one of the key cores is being very explicit about who the first users are and then making them incredibly happy.
We're talking about patterns from hits. We're talking about when something that was an unlikely hit that shipped and was able to break through and sell millions and delight millions of people and hold on to retention and really drive that. What are the patterns? We talked about one, really starting with that re-engagement loop, that core experience, while also thinking through the journey. That was pattern 1.
That's the really key thing. It's not make a thing that is everything to everyone. It has to be a very specific thing that solves a problem or a need or makes someone feel something, and not anyone a particular super fan, super subset. If you try to have empathy for absolutely everyone, then you actually have empathy for no one. It doesn't solve the need for anyone. You're boiling the ocean.
It's really true. And it's true of all forms of creative endeavors and all innovation.
Focus is saying no.
Yeah. And it's hard to do. It's actually very hard to do, which is why we've developed tools to help people do it. Now, the third, so empathizing with the right people at the right stage of your development, that's the trick.
That sounds like the first step, right? In terms of, reading your book, Game Thinking, it's finding the super fans.
So we have 3 big steps and we implement them as sprints. And it's a system. The output of one is the input to the next. The first is discover. That's where you're both testing your ideas, like Will Wright style. Don't be too in love with it. Really see what's right and wrong with it. That's the discover. And discover the right people to test it with. Find those super fans. Then design. Use that as input to your design, particularly the existing habits of your hot core super fans are an incredible design input for everyone, expert to beginner. and really designing that re-engagement idea within the context of a journey that's at a high level, not pull yourself out of the weeds. And so a really great example of that a lot of people are familiar with is Slack. You've used Slack, right, Garry?
Yeah, they just got bought by Salesforce today, I believe.
I saw that, and at least if you can believe what you read on Twitter. But yeah, it's very exciting. I've known Stuart for many, many years. I'm so thrilled for them. Amazing journey. It's really interesting to look at Slack and step back and say, oh, what's the Slack journey? And one thing about a good journey is it's not just a grab bag of a bunch of features, everything but the kitchen sink. It's got a coherence to it. It's got a through line, something that's a red thread, as they say in narrative, that really connects it. And here's the Slack journey: discovery, onboarding, habit building, and mastery. That's a journey to mastery. Discovery is usually social. People tell you about it. They pull you into their Slack. Your team gets pulled in, etc. Onboarding in Slack, which is learning the ropes. Interestingly, Slack is a multiplayer environment. It's a social environment. You use it with your team, but onboarding's a single player experience with a bot who teaches you the ropes so that you don't make a fool of yourself in the multiplayer environment where people are more experienced, which is exactly the pattern from games. I mean, I'm sure you've played at some point a console game where you interacted with a bot or a set of bots, and then you went into the live.
Yeah, totally. It's safer to do it practice first, and then you're in.
That's right. So the design technique, creating a single player bot based interactive experience for a multiplayer game, is something a lot of game designers are familiar with. And exactly how and when you do it, like we did it on Covet Fashion. I've been doing it recently with mobile game designers I'm working with. A lot of people understand that in gaming. Slack implemented it, and they did it in a way with no gamification in the interface, no stupid points and badges cluttering anything up. It's just in the engine of it. It's in the way the experience unfolds, right? Now let's look at habit building. What's habit building in Slack? It's basically making it your own. Look at the 30-day experience into Slack, right? Like I'm telling you, 21 days. What does it look like? Well, maybe you've customized the colors in your interface because you figured it out. Maybe you learned how to use emojis because you figured it out. Maybe you've created your own channel. Maybe you've joined a few other Slacks so you see that you can switch between them. Things unfolded over time. And then all the way to mastery. What does mastery look like in Slack? Mastery is more of a vector than a destination. What is it in Slack? It's the same through line. It's customization. What can you do to go deeper? Launch your own channel, program up the welcome bot, integrate into their API. It keeps going. That's the mastery path. There's no game design in the interface, but part of why Slack's so effective.
I like how thoughtful that is. I mean, it's one thing to look at product from a list of features that are then prioritized. That's sort of the traditional classical way a product manager would try to prioritize and give structure to building software for people. I like this. What is the mental model for the customer? And then what is their actual journey over time? And then that way you're actually designing. I think from gaming and media, it's quite common for people to storyboard. This sounds the natural outgrowth of that.
Well, that leads me to the third pattern, the third core pattern that I saw in all these hits. Test ideas in rough form. Make storyboards. Make storyboards of people using your product, not just the interface of the product itself. How do you know what they should look like? You use the input from your discovery research about the habits and context of your superfans. That's where you get it. And so that's the third piece is once you've designed, you don't start detailing all the interface. You make storyboards over time. And you've got some interface there, but you show people using the product through discovery, onboarding, habit building, and mastery in your product over time. And then you test it and you run it by these hardcore superfans that you've identified. And you say, does this ring true? Is this how you would use it? What are you thinking? Does this embed in your life? Who would you want to share this with? Blah, blah, blah. And again, you shave like a year off your development time. And the thing about low fidelity artifacts is you get different feedback from them. They don't look done. Nobody's afraid of hurting your feelings. You get far less false positives. And it really forces you to not be attached to the art. I mean, how many times, Garry, have you been working on some project and people put a lot of a care and attention and testing and thoughtfulness into the interface, and they made this beautiful art, and then it was like the wrong feature set? It's really hard. It's sunk cost fallacy, and it's really hard to let it go. It's really hard to hear the input. So when you on purpose do a bunch of low fidelity testing, like I learned on Rock Band, like I learned from Will Wright, it forces you to really test the ideas. It's very powerful and time saving.
Yeah, I think that that's one of the things that startups in particular, founders in particular, really, really need to do is there's sort of the Google way to do things, and then there's the way a scrappy startup needs to do it, and they are never the same thing, really. Infinite access to distribution and capital to create anything you want. That's sort of the high class problem of many tech giants. And that's probably the number one thing I see people who come from that world really struggle with, because in order to create something without infinite capital and infinite distribution, it requires this other type of extreme scrappiness and thoughtfulness. So storyboards and just sort of saving yourself the trouble, throwaway work. It's very, very important through iteration and play testing.
It's hard work, but you get better at it as you do it. And when you start to see the results, it's very addictive. Many people where I've worked with a team have gone on to train up their whole company or their whole department because they got such great value out of it. Game company, fintech company, entertainment company. And what we've done too is really figured out how to speed people up, because in the startup world, you don't have it. It's not Google. You're right. I see the same thing, and I help people get off the tee. It's like you can't assume that. And in the startup world, you're running out of runway. If you can save 3 months of your team's time to get to product market fit, it's a big deal. Those kind of shortcuts that get you 80% of the way there with 20% become very important. Something that gives you directional feedback that's strong versus absolute feedback you could publish in a journal, that kind of thing. One thing that we've done is develop this whole library of little people and sitting and standing and holding cell phones and all the things. Because people say, okay, storyboarding. You're a tech team. Storyboarding. Great. What do I do? It's like, here's your training video. Here's your set of templates. Here's your little content library. Go. Like, make it easy. And it doesn't have to be perfect. This is what I learned from Will Wright. He's such an unusual thinker and a brilliant guy. And by the way, he's got a great masterclass on game design. He was the first game designer masterclass. I have a little 5 tips from it on my channel that everyone can enjoy. 5 game design tips from Will Wright. There's so many more, but just 5 to start. And the very first one is something that I heard from him on every project we worked with. And it was a red thread. It was a theme that was so profound for everyone on the team, which was the most important story is the one unfolding in the player's head. Simple, but as a designer, as a tech designer, as anybody building a SaaS product or a marketplace or anything, this is where that mental model becomes so important. It's really easy to get lost in game mechanics and narratives and all the fun stuff, right? But the real power is something that unfolds and triggers a story in the player's head, in your customer's head, that says, I'm becoming someone that I want to be. I'm upgrading myself. This thing I'm using is helping me do what I want to do. Slack's powerful, not just because it's got that nice mastery path and that coherent mental model. Slack's powerful because it helps people be more effective at collaborating with their team. And the deeper you go, the more effective you can be. That's the real measure. It's skill building.
I guess the other thing that's very difficult about sort of game thinking is actually it delivers a lot of truth. And sometimes the danger zone for frameworks and for product managers trying to figure out how to create their products is there are definitely some systems that sort of tell you what you want to hear. No plan really survives interface with users. Really, it is the equivalent of the getting punched in the face moment when you enter the boxing ring. I think everyone has a plan when they walk into it, but when they walk into the ring, but not after a user sees it and tells you whether it actually works.
Exactly. A lot of what game thinking is about is bringing that earlier in the product, getting that brutal feedback earlier in your project by finding the right people to listen to and test with. So all those pieces work together. You're right. Brutal truth is really hard emotionally. And there's 5 to 7% of people I work with that can't handle it. And they all drop out at the same point where the system starts delivering brutal market truth. It can pop your bubble. What I've found, and I really want to share this with every entrepreneur and aspiring entrepreneur out there. I've worked with a lot of entrepreneurs. I myself has raised money from Sandhill and run a company. I know what it's like. It's gut wrenching. It's so hard. If you can get market truth, your odds of success go up. The longer you don't listen to it, the more you burn through and circle the drain. I mean, it is your lifeblood as an entrepreneur. What I do is help people walk through the fire of that because it's really hard and I know it's hard. But what I've seen over and over again is the very best entrepreneurs have this paradoxical combination of a strong vision and strong ego. You have to, in order to do this, you just have to. Combined with just a driving hunger for market truth and a willingness to iterate their vision to get to market truth. We talked about journey earlier. So Genova Chen, who graduated from the USC game department, where I'm an adjunct. I helped found that department. And I'm just so proud of that department. Genova Chen came out of that. He did Flower. He did Journey. Now he's doing another game that's beautiful and amazing. On Journey, they had so many problems. Their testing showed things weren't working. And he has such a strong vision for the game. But part of why the game was delayed, but eventually a hit, is the amount of testing and revision they did. And that's an example of an entrepreneur whose hunger for market truth exceeds his ego. And both are very big.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the
right.
hardest. That's definitely the hardest thing about starting a company because it is both. You need to have a very, very singular vision. On the other hand, you need to be so rooted in the stark reality of whether or not it delights a user or solves their problem. And that's where people fall down. Like it's entirely possible for people to not have a clear enough vision, just not solve a problem that way. And then on the flip side, they swear that this is the way to solve it. And if they don't have it, it's just obvious in the metrics, in the experience of storyboarding and playtesting. We sort of see both ways to fail. And the only people who actually make it through that are the ones who set aside their ego and take a moment and say, well, I thought I was right, but after much consideration, when the data is presented, I change my mind. What do you do? Right? Like that's sort of the fundamental difficulty of making your way as a founder.
It is, and it's paradoxical. And yet, so much of life is about pulling together paradoxical things to achieve greatness.
Yeah. That's why founders do magic. That's why product managers do magic.
It's so true. One of my favorite quotes from Frank Lloyd Wright is, you can use an eraser on the drafting table or a sledgehammer on the construction site.
Yeah, one's easier.
And what all of this is about is doing more on the drafting table.
Yeah,
doing more experiments, figuring out that's what the storyboards are. They're the drafting table. And once you develop those skills, and that's what we're in the business of doing, is making it easier to execute it. Once you develop those skills and you start to use those tools, you just see that everything goes faster. Ideally, you get addicted to market truth. And what I've also seen that's really exciting is that, especially in game companies, it really promotes a lot of cross-functional collaboration. I've been working for about a year with a really exciting and interesting game company, has trained up multiple groups now. And what they're seeing is that these tools let the designers and the research people work together much earlier than they were before and in a much more collaborative way. They just didn't really have the tools and framework. And it's really helping them hit the mark quicker. And I think one of the things, again, for your audience, for all the entrepreneurs out there, that you can learn from game companies that applies to everybody is part of why these techniques that you and I are talking about, Garry, these like great techniques to help entrepreneurs succeed, part of why they've come out of at least certain game companies, not all, but certain ones, is that gaming is a really brutal business. And there's this 6-week green light process that I'm really accustomed to, where you work in 6-week chunks. And you've got like, okay, you and your team are funded for 6 weeks. You can do this and this and this, but then we're going to have a meeting with the stakeholders and we're going to cut it maybe, because they run multiple experiments. And that means your experiment could get cut. And then if you get the green line on that, you're like, okay, let's go toward like alpha and let's see what you can like do for alpha. But your game could get cut at any point. And so these 6 weeks, sometimes it's 2 and 3 month checkpoints, really build in this discipline. Boy, you need to know that from that data, if it's working or not. And it's really healthy, but it's also kind of brutal.
That's what we sign up for when we're trying to make something brand new. And then the payoff in the end is if you can do it and you're right, you can make a thing for 1 billion people. And that's something that you've been able to do over and over again. I thank you for sharing this. I mean, I think that's the coolest thing that you're doing is a lot of people who have done the things you've done, like it's actually rare for people to go and take a step back and try to sort of pass that on. These are the lessons. Avoid these landmines. And I really appreciate what you do with the books you write and your work with product managers and product people trying to make something. So thank you. I guess I usually end with a lot of the people watching this they haven't even started their careers yet. They are 18 or 22, even trying to decide, do I study product? Do I study economics? Do I study psychology? Do I study computer science, art? People are trying to figure out who they are. What do you wish you knew when you were that age, sort of 18 or 22 and just starting out?
That's such a great question. I wish I had known that if you're a builder and a creator, the way to learn is to build and create. I knew it on some level, but I love learning. I was a great student. I got a PhD, like you gotta love learning. And I really enjoyed learning different frameworks. I enjoyed doing all the things you do with a psych and with a neuroscience degree. But when I look at all the things I've done, and guess what? That was a great background. When I look at all the things I've done, the most important things I've ever learned was when I built something together with a team. So I think that combination of just getting your hands dirty, find a way. I think you could get almost any degree in college. First of all, college is being tremendously disrupted. So like what to study, goodness. One of the things I loved about game design, I told you the story of going to the Game Developers Conference way back when and finding my tribe. One of the things I learned about it is there were philosophy majors there. There were lots of coders who had turned into game designers. There were people that had studied medieval history. Lots of them actually. There were artists. There were people that were musicians and had become sound designers in gaming. All of them were there together. And it was beautiful. It was so exciting. I love that. And I feel like tech is potentially like that. My drive to be both an entrepreneur and teacher really comes from my parents. I wanted to mention that briefly. My father is a lifelong entrepreneur whose father was a first generation immigrant from, Russian Jewish immigrant and total entrepreneur. So I come from that, but my mother is a teacher and she's an amazing teacher. And I really feel like I got both of those. And I'm very, very invested in empowering other people. I also think if you're a system designer, it's another system to design and to perfect and to tweak and to tune. I'm very engaged with my students and the people that we've trained and the people we've certified. And my goal is to save millions of entrepreneurs billions of hours of time as they find product market fit.
Me too. So that's why I think that's why I really like what you're doing. I mean, to riff on your point about just game design, I would love for tech to be a lot more like game design because, I would like it to be a place that is that inclusive and that diverse, not just in background but also just in experience and wants and needs. There's sort of this problem now in tech where the monoculture causes everyone to be basically the same, want the same things, solve all the same problems. I think that that's one of the things that really faces it's an impediment to what I think tech could be in society. Thank you for bringing that to the fore. I think the world needs polymaths. We need people who can go and basically they can and should belong in every kind of room is what we need. And that's how we make better products.
Well, to that point, speaking to all the 18 to 20-year-olds out there wanting to build skills, follow your interests. Pay attention to what engages you. Follow your passions and your skills. And guess what? If you happen to learn to code along the way, it doesn't hurt. It's been extremely useful for me to know how to code, to know how computers work, to know how a compiler works, to know how systems work. Not everybody needs to, but I actually personally believe that a lot of our problems today are that people are not system thinkers. They don't think in systems. When you talk about and when you talk about product management and features, that's not systems. There's so many collections of features, but how do you create a coherent mental model? You're going to do it through systems. One of my great passions is educating people about that. I'm collaborating with Mike Sellers, who, by the way, was the creator of an MMO even before Ultima Online called Meridian 59. And guess who was on Meridian 59's dev team? John Hankey, founder of Pokemon Go.
Oh, wow.
So it goes, relationships are a long game. Anyway, Mike Sellers now runs the advanced game design program at Indiana University. And we're working on a collaborative course, which will be available next year, system design for product leaders.
That's amazing. So I guess this audience has so much to learn from all of the things that you've already put together. I mean, it's a lot. Back in the first .com boom, you wrote one of the first books on online communities, and then of course now your newest book is called Game Thinking, and so I'll link that in the description. And then aside from that, you have a YouTube channel, Game Thinking TV. So we'll link to that too.
Let's see.
Awesome. That's the book. I have the Kindle version.
There's the book.
Yeah.
There's the book.
So yeah, I mean, there are lots of ways to engage. And then beyond that, you have actually live workshops that they're all listed on gamethinking.io, I believe.
That's correct. So if you want to pick up the book, if you want to check out our podcast, if you want to find out about our Game Thinking TV YouTube channel and subscribe, you should definitely subscribe. If you want to find out about our live workshops, we do them quarterly. We also have a certification program where we train professionals from all over the world to master these tools and bring them to their teams.
That's awesome.
GameThinking.io.
So there's so many ways to basically, I mean, skip ahead, really. It's like, you could struggle and knock your head against a wall over and over again. Or if you pick up Game Thinking, then it'll teach you how to think and you'll think faster. You'll get to your destination faster. And so I'm excited about that. Amy Jo, I always learn so much when I spend time with you. And I'm just really glad you could share that with all of us today.
It's a total pleasure, Garry. Thank you so much.